Now let's listen to a read aloud of George versus George. As I read, I would like for you to jot noticings about each person in your reading journal. George versus George, the American Revolution as seen from both sides. Introduction. There were once two enemies who were both named George. George Washington was the man who freed the American colonies from the British, and George III was the British king who lost them. So George Washington was the man who freed the American colonies from the British, and King George III was the British king who lost them. Was King George a royal brute? American patriots said so, but others held him as the father of the people. Was George Washington a traitor? The king's supporters thought so, but many celebrated Washington as the father of his country. Who was right? There are two sides to every story. So, on the left, we see King George Washington. He was the commander-in-chief of the Continental Army and president of the United States of America. Now, did I say on the left? Yes, George Washington. And on the right, King George III. He was the King of England and the rest of the British Empire, including the American colonies. And we see that this kind of sets the stage. There are two sides to every story. We have George versus George. At first glance, the year was 1763, and in many ways, George Washington of America and King George III of Great Britain were very much alike. Both men had light blue eyes and reddish-brown hair. Athletic and dignified in appearance, each stood well over 6 feet tall, towering above most other men during a time when the average height was 5 feet 7 inches. Both were honest and popular with the public. They liked simple food and much preferred plain clothes to the high-fashion outfits of the period decorated with lace, ruffles, and embroidery. George III was sometimes called Farmer George because of his lifelong interest in agriculture. George Washington was a farmer who was happiest when working on his land. Both were excellent horsemen and loved hunting. George III believed that a king should rule America. For a long time, George Washington thought so too. He had even fought bravely alongside the British Army. And so here we see George Washington on his horse, and it says, "Mark yon tall and daring warrior, a people yet unborn will hail him as the father of a mighty empire." Indian chief fought alongside George Washington in 1755. And this caption says, King George usually wore a white wig, which we see depicted here, which was the height of fashion in those days. And George Washington sometimes powdered his hair to make it look white. And here we see King George, and we see the flag of Great Britain in the background. It says, "Of him we are much inclined to hope great things." And this is Samuel Johnson speaking, the greatest English writer of his day. The people of Great Britain and the people of Britain's American colonies had a lot in common too. Most everyone on both sides of the ocean liked their good-natured young patriot king. English was their main language. After all, 60% of the colonists had British ancestors. London was everybody's capital city, and many Americans proudly thought of England as home. Great Britain had just won the 7 Years' War, which involved almost every country in Europe and extended all the way to India and Australia. King George was now the ruler of the world's greatest empire. As loyal citizens of Great Britain, colonial soldiers had joined forces with soldiers from England to fight against France for control of North America. As loyal citizens of Great Britain, colonial soldiers had joined forces with soldiers from England to fight against France for control of North America. Why is this information important? The footnote here says, the part of the 7 Years' War fought in North America is called the French and Indian War. When France gave up its territories, jubilant celebrations were held throughout both England and America. Jubilant. What does this word jubilant mean? Okay, yes, jubilant does mean happy. Who could imagine that the fabric binding America to Great Britain was about to unravel, or that the two Georges were about to become bitter enemies? Let me stop and think. Who could imagine that the fabric binding America to Great Britain was about to unravel, or that the two Georges were about to become bitter enemies? What does this word unravel mean? And if the binding is unraveling, what is happening? Turn and talk. Okay. Now, how does this describe what happened between the colonies and Great Britain, this unraveling? Turn and talk. Okay. Who could guess that George III would be the last king of America and that George Washington would one day become its first president? Neither George Washington nor King George III was fully responsible for everything that happened next. Many other thinkers, soldiers, and politicians helped to shape the future. Even so, as leaders of the two sides, these two Georges were to become the strongest symbols of their countries during the next 20 years. The different ideas they stood for would soon turn the whole world upside down.